Hospital trusts were repeatedly warned about cyber threats before the attack on computer systems on Friday, Defense Secretary Michael Fallon has said. He told One's Andrew Marr the NHS was given a large chunk of money to improve its security. Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said on Saturday that an annual £5.5 million deal with Microsoft to protect NHS devices had been renewed in 2014 but not since. A handful of trusts are still dealing with disruption caused by the hack. The NHS, Fedex and the main telecoms operator in Spain were among 200,000 known victims of Friday's global cyber attack. But Europol head Rob Wainwright said he was concerned that the number affected would continue to rise when people returned to work on Monday morning. He told the BBC there was an escalating threat from the virus, known as Wanna Decryptor or WannaCry, adding, "We've never seen anything like this, it's unprecedented in scale." The ransomware, which locked users' files and demanded payment to allow access, spread to 150 countries, including Spain, Russia, the US and China. In England, 48 trusts reported problems at hospitals, GP surgeries or pharmacies, and 13 NHS organisations in Scotland were also affected. Some hospitals were forced to cancel treatment and appointments and, unable to use computers, many doctors resorted to using pen and paper. Warned again and again. Asked by Andrew Marr if the government had failed to give the NHS proper support and failed to pay for crucial upgrades to security in 2015, Defence Secretary Sir Michael said £1.9 billion had been set aside for UK cyber protection, when cyber attacks were identified as one of three main threats to the UK's defences. Of that, he said, we're spending around £50 million on the NHS cyber systems to improve their security. We have encouraged NHS trusts to reduce their exposure to the weakest system, the Windows XP. Fewer than 5% of the trusts used XP now, he said. We want them to use modern systems that are better protected. We warned them, and they were warned again in the spring. They were warned again of the threats. However, Kingsley Manning, a former chairman of NHS Digital, which provides the health services IT systems, told the BBC on Saturday that several 100,000 computers were still running on Windows XP. And Shadow Health Secretary Jonathan Ashworth wrote to Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt on Saturday asking why concerns repeatedly flagged up about the NHS's outdated, unsupported and vulnerable machines had not been addressed. Speaking to ITV's Robert Beston, Mr Ashworth accused the government of having cut the IT and infrastructure budget by £1 billion in the NHS, and said his party, if elected to power, would put £10 billion into the infrastructure of the NHS. He went on to demand that the Conservatives publish the Department of Health's risk register to see how seriously they were taking IT threats. Mr Hunt has not publicly responded to the attack, but Home Secretary Amber Rudd said the priority was to disrupt it. Meanwhile, digital rights campaigners Open Rights Group has accused GCHQ of a very dangerous strategy of hoarding knowledge of security problems. It said Britain's electronic surveillance agency was in charge of hacking us and protecting us from hackers, making it hard to balance the risks of keeping vulnerabilities secret. Jim Killock, the group's executive director, said, US and UK security agencies kept a widespread vulnerability secret rather than telling the companies so they could fix it. He called for the National Cybersecurity Centre to be made independent from GCHQ. Just 1 week before the virus caused mass disruption across the NHS, a neurology registrar from London, Dr. Krishnachan Thapli, publicly raised his concerns, warning in the British Medical Journal that hospitals would almost certainly be shut down by ransomware this year. He told the BBC the NHS was in a tricky position, treating sick patients, as a 24/7 operation with specialist software, making update implementation complicated. People developing ransomware know a hospital is a good target because the information is about patients and is time sensitive. Hospitals need to get their data back quicker, he said. Attacks on hospital data and patients were despicable at the basic level, he said. At Barts Health NHS Trust, which is still experiencing IT disruption since the attack, planned surgery and outpatient appointments will be reduced on Monday. The Trust, which runs 5 hospitals, the Royal London, Newham, Whipps Cross, Mile End and St Bartholomew's, has told patients to attend booked appointments on Monday. Those people whose appointments are cancelled will be contacted directly by their hospital, it added. In Scotland, Justice Secretary Michael Matheson said more than 120 public bodies were being contacted to ensure their defences were adequate. He said NHS systems in Scotland were expected to be recovered by Monday, adding that there was no evidence that patient data has been compromised. He reassured patients with appointments they should attend as planned. The cost of the attack is unknown, in the UK or beyond, but BBC analysis of 3 accounts linked to the ransom demands suggest hackers have already been paid the equivalent of £22,080. Europol has said it is working with the US Federal Bureau of Investigation to find those responsible, and that more than one person was likely to be involved. The Liberal Democrats and Labour have both demanded an inquiry into the cyber attack. Jeremy Hunt has been accused of ignoring extensive warning signs which could have prevented an unprecedented cyber attack from plunging the NHS into chaos. Hospitals across England and Scotland have been crippled by the global attack, which saw about 45 organisations infiltrated by malicious software on Friday. A number of hospitals were forced to cancel procedures after medical staff reported seeing computers go down one by one as the attack took hold, locking machines and demanding money to release the data. About a fifth of trusts were hit, with 6 still affected 24 hours later, amid concerns networks were left vulnerable because they were still using outdated Windows XP software. The apparent chink in the NHS's defences led to criticism of the Tories after the government decided not to extend a £5.5 million support deal with Microsoft for Windows XP in 2015. Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth, in a letter to Mr Hunt, said concerns were repeatedly flagged about outdated computer systems. The public has a right to know exactly what the government will do to ensure that such an attack is never repeated again, he wrote. Mr Ashworth demanded to know why NHS organisations had failed to act on a critical note from Microsoft 2 months ago, what resources were being given to the NHS to bring the situation under control and what arrangements were in place to protect the NHS against cyber attacks. There have been repeated warnings about the vulnerability of the outdated NHS systems, including from the National Cybersecurity Centre and the National Crime Agency, Mr Ashworth said. May had been left extremely vulnerable to an attack since 2015, when they continued to use an outdated version of Windows after a security package had been stopped. NHS trusts have been running thousands of outdated and unsupported Windows XP machines despite the government ending its annual £5.5 million deal with Microsoft, which provided ongoing security support for Windows XP. In May 2015, Mr Ashworth wrote. It effectively means that unless individual trusts were willing to pay Microsoft for an extended support deal, since May 2015 their operating systems have been extremely vulnerable to being hacked, he added. A Freedom of Information request in February found a total of 79 English trusts have suffered ransomware attacks since June 2015, he said. Speaking after a COBRA meeting on Saturday, Home Secretary Amber Rudd admitted there's always more that can be done to protect against viruses. She said, if you look at who's been impacted by this virus, it's a huge variety across different industries and across international governments. This is a virus that attacked Windows platforms. The fact is the NHS has fallen victim to this. I don't think it's to do with that preparedness. There's always more we can all do to make sure we're secure against viruses, but I think there have already been good preparations in place by the NHS to make sure they were ready for this sort of attack. However, Ms Rudd was accused of wild complacency over her response, and many questioned why Mr Hunt had remained quiet during the crisis. Lord Paddock, Liberal Democrat Home Affairs spokesman and a former Metropolitan Police Deputy Assistant Commissioner, said Ms Rudd was more suited to the era of analog. "We need to get to the bottom of why the government thought cyber attacks were not a risk, when a combination of warnings and plain common sense should have told ministers that there is a growing and dangerous threat to our cybersecurity," he said. "It is worrying that in Amber Rudd we have a Home Secretary in the digital age more suited to the era of analog. This is not the first time she has looked lost in cyberspace. The government likes to look tough, but this is an example of where it has left Britain defenseless."